All right, Chad, good to go.
All righty, thank you, Andy. We will start with call to order. So this is a meeting of Private Forest Accord Mitigation Advisory Committee, Wednesday, August 9th, and we'll begin with roll call. So Andy, can you please call roll?
Yes. Chad Washington,
Present.
Paul Van Dyke, Kristen Ricard.
Can you note that the excused absences, Andy?
Yep, will do.
And Heath Curtis.
Heath, all right, perfect timing, Heath. Fran Cafferata,
Present.
Andrew Perky, Mark Stern,
I'm here.
Mark Greenbaum,
Here.
Jennifer Weichel,
Here.
Kate Wells,
Here.
Chris Allen,
Present.
Sarah Gregory. All right, well, it does look like we have quorum, Chad, to move forward now, so we can actually adopt the meeting minutes.
Very good. So that is the only item for the consent agenda. So has everyone had time to review the meeting minutes? And if so, I'll accept the motion to approve them.
Yeah, I move to approve the meeting minutes.
Very good. Do we have a second?
Sure. Second.
That
Thanks,
Heath?
Heath. It was. Can you call that, Andy? Or how do we want to do the vote?
No, that's usually, we'll just do the motion and then we'll second it, so it's passed.
Done.
So we can move on to the next one.
Great. Do we have anybody registered for public comment?
Nope, no one's registered at this time. If anyone's online and would like to, please feel free to raise a hand. See anything?
All right, Andy. Well, if there's no public comment, then I believe you're up for the next agenda item, which would be the staff report.
Great. If someone is going to speak up, please be sure to just unmute yourself. I'm working on one very small screen here, and I'm looking at notes on it at the same time. So I'm hoping for this agenda item, it is going to be more discussion. I sent all of you the updated staff report that will now be coming with every agenda item to help provide additional context into everything. It'll have a program update at the beginning. So I'm not going to get into too much detail. We've already gone through much of it. One big highlight is the organ administrative rules that were passed on the 4th last week. So that was a great accomplishment for everyone. Thank you everyone for the hard work. What I really wanted to update the committee on was 3 main points. The first being the grant review process. I sent you guys, you had a short blurb in the staff report, but I also sent about a 2-page detailed report on that grant review process, outlining 4 different stages, which I'll touch on real briefly here. And then I have some questions for the committee. The first stage was the initial quality control and completion check by ODF&W, where we just essentially checked the box that the application was submitted as requested with all the materials. Stage 2 is a review team assessments, where they will get together across the state. We're looking at 3 or 4 review teams, and they will evaluate all the proposals based off the worksheets that some of the working groups have already completed. We then have stage 3, which is a MAC review and recommendation to commission. Then we have the stage 4, where we will present to Fish and Wildlife Commission. Again, I would reference the very detailed 2-page document that I sent that talks about each one of those stages in depth. And I'm happy to have that discussion now if anyone had any questions about the stages. But some outstanding questions that we did have in anticipation for our fall launch, which is exciting around the corner. We got the OERs done, and now we have this next big thing. We're hopefully looking at a fall launch in around early October First question is how long we want to open it for, 6 or 8 weeks. Mark Grimberger gave some insight that he recommended 8 weeks, I believe, just because, this is a new grant program, gives applicants some time to interface with us. The flip side being, that pushes 2 or 3 weeks down the road when we want to approve for commission, which is looking like in March of next year. Any considerations on how long the RFP should be open, the request for proposals? Any concerns with it being 8 weeks long? Oh, Mark, sir.
I think 8 weeks makes sense. Would we hit that March commission meeting either way, whether it's 6 weeks or 8 weeks?
I had it planned out just yesterday at 6 weeks. It brought us to middle of February. So if we did 8 weeks, we should still be able to. I will go confirm that, but yeah, we should still be able to hit that March one with 8. I built in like a month buffer after 6 weeks. Any concerns with anyone if we do 8 weeks? All right. I think it's better. I mean, from my perspective, I think 8 weeks is great for a new grant program. Gives people time to really delve in. So I will readjust those timelines in just a minute here. Great. So the next point of discussion I wanted to ask the committee. So during stage 3, the MAC's going to meet in person, which I'll get to shortly. And that's where they're going to review all the proposals. We're also going to review the review team evaluations at that 2-day meeting. And it was recommended that we vote anonymously using voting software from the committee. And I was just hoping everyone was all right with that thought. Again, kind of just a general discussion of the review process and evaluation, if everyone's comfortable with that. Is there any concerns using voting software from the committee? Or does anyone need clarification on that?
And what's the reason for voting anonymously?
It was just recommended because some other programs have used it. I didn't have any reason to make it anonymous. Heath, unless Heath recommended the idea of just the voting software, did you have any considerations on that?
I think Mark Grimberger may have suggested that was how OWEB did it, but Mark Stern, you may have some visibility there as well. I can't say I'm wedded to anonymity, but unless it has to be disclosed, I suppose I'd rather avoid the politics. That is to say, if we're voting using, kind of weighted priorities, using like a dot voting system, and some applicant is dissatisfied with how an individual member voted, I don't really think it helps the process to focus the attention on that individual member of the mitigation advisory committee. And so, unless there's some utility in publishing the voting, I think there's some advantage to maintaining it anonymous.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Heath, and I don't have any problem with that. I think for me, sometimes it's an interesting dialogue, but hopefully among the MAC at large, we'd be having conversations on the pros and cons of our different perspectives on the projects before we voted. So I imagine we'll have some sense of, how each of us are feeling about different things at that time. And I guess that's what I was more interested in, is just the give and take to help us all have a clear understanding of what any given project is trying to do.
And Andy, we had discussed like this idea that, a project coming out of a vote, like in that manner, that receives a low point threshold or a low point total may, like, if there's somebody who feels strongly that that vote doesn't accurately reflect the priority or the value of that project, they should be encouraged to make that case. And, You know, I had never thought that the vote itself was writing anything in stone.
Yeah, exactly, Heath. There's still gonna be plenty of room for discussion before, and Mark, to address your comment. That is the idea, is that the voting would take place near the middle to end of the day, essentially. It would be after presentations from the review teams on the proposals and then a discussion with the committee. Then we would go to vote. And if it was a clean vote and it matched with how much money we have, then that's great. Otherwise, yeah, we would have further discussion, like Heath was saying, where we might cherry pick some projects to move up and down. But the vote's just there to add some guardrails, I guess, or, you know, guidelines, really. Did anyone else? That's kind of all I wanted to update on the grant review process. I didn't want to get too much into the weeds since I sent that. The working group has one more meeting. I believe at the end of August, we have scheduled to finalize that. So we're coming to September and I'll probably give a more thorough update on that. But before we move on past that, did anyone have any other questions or points of clarification for the review process?
Well, hey, Andy, this is not specifically about the review process, but in the sort of going back and getting my head into today's meetings, I looked at some of the other documents as well. I guess just one observation is we give an awful lot of attention to urgent grants and urgent grants this and urgent grants that. And I guess we've talked about it some. The preferred pathway, of course, is through the regular grant process. But I just think even like in the framework and in the grant document, they're sort of highlighted, and it's. I would think it might be worth thinking about if we want to have some language that makes it really clear that it's the exception to the rule, not the pathway you go because staff members going on vacation, so you need to get this project approved sooner or something. And I think the other part of it is it's not only that the applicant then all of a sudden has some urgency, but then it's going to mean you have to deal with it more urgently. The MAC has to deal with it more urgently, has to get to the commission more urgently. And then ODF&W has to have the capacity to, are they going to put that grant then at the top of the pile for all the administrative stuff they're processing? And so, if we have a couple urgent grants a year, that's probably not a big deal. But if all of a sudden we only have one, and I'm going to guess we're going to end up having two RFPs a year, but I'm just saying we don't want a flood of urgent grants. And I think we could have some language that would make it clear that you really got to make your case because it's a higher barrier to get considered just sort of when you want to, as opposed to in the normal process. Yeah. So I made a few notes in one of the team's documents, but I guess I'd just encourage you to go back if others agree and make it clear that pathway is a more limited pathway and not just, oh, you missed the deadline and you don't want to wait a year.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. We agree with that sentiment. That's been my concern recently too. Me and Sarah and others have talked about how we can better identify that this is not for everyone. So it is on my to-do list actually later this month to clarify that language in the grant guidelines. It will be very clear in that process, more detailed as you're requesting. So thank you for that insight. I agree. I have the same concern that people will just punt to that. Heath?
I think maybe mechanically the concern there is that this body gets overwhelmed by having to figure out what to do with those urgent requests. Mark, to your point, given that there is always the ordinary application pathway, personally, I would be very comfortable with staff playing a very substantive role in eliminating non-urgent applications prior to bringing them to this body. And I suppose I would encourage that kind of process.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, that's exactly what my goal was there, Heath, is there's kind of two firewalls before it gets to the committee. Essentially, it is staff initially that will have a pre-application meeting. The pre-application will get filled out following that meeting. It will then go to a subcommittee of the MAC here. They'll review the pre-application independently of the grantee. And if they all vote to move it up to the committee, that's when it gets there for your guys' consideration. So there is pretty substantial effort before. And then they have to fill out a full application after the pre-app. So it isn't as easy as the regular process. Chad?
Thank you for that, Andy. I was just going to say that I share Mark Stern's concern and support Heath's solution, which is what you basically just outlined. So making sure that that's clear in the grant guidelines will also help kind of ease the burden for you so that there's just fewer to sort through.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this conversation. And we're all on the same page there. I got the exact same concern. All right, thank you, Mark, for bringing that up.
I just had one thing, and for the benefit of the public attendees, I'm Sarah Reif, I'm the Habitat Division Administrator. Helping support Andy in this program. Can you remind the group what our goal date is for approval of the grant guidelines by the committee? Is that next meeting or when are you?
Thank you for that reminder. Yeah, so the grant guidelines, we're hoping to get approved by September, right? If we want to do an October launch. I guess there could be a world where we look at, maybe mid-September, holding a separate one if we have to, but keep in mind, we've had a working group meet twice now in the last 2 months or in the last month on those draft guidelines. I resent them in your packet earlier this week.
And so if committee members would like to provide any additional comment, when would you like that by in order to be able to get a final draft out before the next meeting?
Yeah, thank you. If you can provide comments, let's see, our next meeting is, sorry, give me just a minute here. I think it's September 6th. Yeah, our next meeting, September 6th. I'm preparing the packet. So if you guys could get me your comments by the end of next week, the 18th, that'd be very, very helpful because I usually prepare these meeting packets about a week or two ahead of time. I try to. I know this week I got it out a little late. But if you could get me comments by the 18th of next, that would be great. Because that also gives me opportunity to work with Chad and Bob on additional edits. I sent you all your own Word document because Teams has been a little difficult lately. So feel free to make edits in there and send it my way and track changes or something if that's easiest for you. If you would like a link to the shared document, I'm happy to send it to you. But yeah, at this point, it's been reviewed twice and really need that input. I do hope to hold a public webinar relatively soon, which I would update you guys in September about. While we're on that, sorry, go ahead.
Andy, if you can send the shared link, that'd be great.
Okay, I will get that out. Any other questions on the grant guidelines? I know it wasn't on our discussion, but while we are talking about any clarification needing or anything? I will send you guys that updated shared link and I will remind everyone by the 18th if I can get edits. We are working on finalizing our grant agreements and everything. And all those templates that you see in that grant guidelines are already created. They're just getting formalized and finalized with different departments. I'm going to move on to the next topic for the staff report. Well, before we get to land acquisition, I want to talk about the in-person MAC meeting. You guys would have noticed that I removed the calendar hold for January because after looking at our launch and planning out the 6 weeks, it was looking like early February we would be meeting. So assuming 8 weeks now, probably would be a mid-February. So I'll resend something later this week or early next week for a mid to late February meeting. For in-person, and that's when again the committee is going to get together. We're going to be a 2-day meeting to get presentations from the review teams, and then we would vote on proposal recommendation to the commission. That, and we'll send you guys a new calendar. That will take place in Portland, most likely at the World Forestry Center.
And you're thinking if we meet in mid to late February, you can still get that on the March commission meeting?
Mid-February maybe, but we're pushing at that point. We gotta look at what commission date is also in March.
Yeah, I think we can have placeholder exhibits in with the commission. And then be updating those placeholders with the final selected projects, much like we do for the Conservation and Recreation Fund. Where we sometimes don't even approve the projects until the week before the commission meeting.
Yeah, that timeline for reviews I built in the holiday season. So just keep that in mind. That is why we're delayed a little bit too. It's because of the holidays. We're just abating it. All right, so I'll send you guys that hold next week. The last thing I wanted to talk about was land acquisition and the recommendation that we hold off on this first year of land acquisition. Again, I went into detail in the staff report, so I won't go over it again unless you guys want some clarifications. But my recommendation is after launch this year that we would get together a working group with this committee, but also with OWEB and some of ODFW's land acquisition programs and start to build our land acquisition portfolio. Was there any concerns with us holding off on year one for acquisition? Or support? I'll take support too. You just hear concerns.
I'm just curious if you run it by Colt at all, because they're the ones that might raise some concerns.
They're going to be my phone call after this meeting.
I wonder, just for the sake of the members of the public that are listening in today, if Andy, if you'd be willing to just articulate a bit more of the reasoning why why we're thinking that that's necessary.
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. That's a good idea. I guess not everyone got my report. For land acquisitions, they do require different documentations from restoration projects to, easements. They're very complex. So I just want to make sure that we build a program that's robust, that's not going to work, that we really think through, so we're not changing requirements on applicants year after year until we get it right. We also need, staff capacity to implement on year one. It's not quite there for acquisitions. And one of the bigger concerns I have is reviewing acquisitions. It's a different review process. It's a different review team, different technical experts that we got to make sure, knows what they're doing and what they're reviewing. Heath?
Yeah, Andy, I think we've got to proceed that with a question about whether we want a specific program on land acquisitions. Like, that in many ways institutionalizes that pathway for spending PFA money. And as we've discussed, I have real reticence about spending PFA money on land acquisition. Before we build a program that involves staff and defines a specific path for land acquisition, I think we should have a conversation about whether that's a good idea. In my view, land acquisition is one of many types of projects we juggle, and it is not necessarily any more involved or difficult than conservation easements or even restoration projects, including the permitting that may be involved for restoration projects. It's not involved for land acquisitions, and so the idea that we would institutionalize a pathway for land acquisition with these monies is not something this group has discussed, and I'd appreciate an opportunity to do that before we build something of this nature.
Thank you, Heath. Mark?
Mark, I think you can go ahead with your comment.
Yeah, I think it does require discussion too, and I think I sort of have a little bit of the same reaction. I'm not sure land acquisition necessarily means it's more complicated than a big complicated restoration project. The other, is food for thought. Several years ago when the Department of Forestry had, I think, what they called their dry forest restoration program, and they were giving out grants all of a sudden, and they didn't have the internal structure to do that. They actually worked with OWEB, and OWEB managed that grant program for the Department of Forestry. It maybe still does, I don't know. But I guess where I'm going with that is, if one possibility might be is rather than recreate a land acquisition effort, could mimic or maybe use OWEB as the arm to facilitate that when a land acquisition was appropriate.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Chad, I think I see your hand.
Yeah. You know, to both Heath and Mark's point, I don't know if we need to build a program specific to land acquisition. I do support delaying any land acquisition grants, certainly, trying to move money into those projects in the first year. And maybe not necessarily to build out a land acquisition program as part of this grant fund, but to help inform what land acquisition grant should have in the grant requirements. And this is where I'd like to see things like deed restrictions. I mean, if we're talking about protection, and if these are done under the effort of protecting the land, ownership doesn't necessarily mean protection. It needs to have a permanent protection, either a conservation easement in perpetuity or a deed restriction. And these are things that I think the meetings you referenced would inform, but not necessarily to develop a land acquisition program, but to refine what the grant requirements for land acquisition should include. And that's all I've got on that.
Yeah, I think we're a little hung up on the word program. I don't think we're talking about creating with a separate staff and something that's called a program. But what we are talking about is needing the time to build all of the different documentation that goes with land acquisition proposals. For state government, funding acquisitions is a very complex and highly scrutinized endeavor. It would need specific application questions, land use information, management plans, environmental site assessments, survey requirements, title investigation requirements, and then perhaps different skill sets on the review team. And so I think that's what Andy's talking about in terms of needing the time to build that out, to build templates with Department of Justice for agreements that would go along with those acquisitions. So I appreciate Mark's suggestion of potentially leaning on OWEB for some of this. I don't know if Mark Grenbemmer has any opinions on that right now, or whether that's something OWEB would entertain, but I appreciate that concept, why reinvent the wheel? And that's something that we can look into and have further conversations with OWEB. But I think we're not necessarily talking about creating a whole separate program that somehow begins to overshadow restoration projects. I think we're just talking about needing to sort of build up the sort of administrative elements before we include acquisitions in an RFP.
Thanks for clarifying that, Sarah. Chad has his hand up, but Mark, I saw you got unmuted. I didn't know.
Oh, I was just going to respond to Sarah. And I think Chris would echo this as well. We're happy to share lessons learned and advise on, the pros and cons and things. You're absolutely right, Sarah. It's a whole different can of worms, and there's a lot of really specific requirements, and you did a really good job of the laundry list. So we have an incredible acquisitions lead on our staff, and I know she would be more than happy to help with any framework discussion or advice. But I'm not sure this is something we would take on, but we're willing to at least have the discussion.
Thank you, Mark, for that insight. Appreciate it. I think we've already kind of started revolving around that a little bit. Chad?
Yeah, and yeah, before we would entertain land acquisition grants, I would also like to have comment from the services and from Jennifer Weichel, around, does this meet mitigation? Does this meet what we're trying to do for these covered species? And does it satisfy that mitigation requirement? What does that look like? What needs to be included in a grant proposal for an acquisition in order for it to qualify, if it does qualify? So I think there's just a lot of discussion left before we're looking at acquisitions. So, if the suggestion is to hold off on year one, it sounds like there's a lot of reasons to do so. I would also invite Jennifer Weichel to weigh in if she would like to now, or maybe, after she's had some time to think about it. But, I think right now we should hold off on year one for multiple reasons. There's just more work to be done, and we can discuss further in the in-person meeting.
I'll just say, sorry, this is Jennifer. Just a couple thoughts, just right off the top of my head. I know I've mentioned this before, but the HCP is definitely in development. There's a lot still to be worked out with regards to the content. And we've really not sat down and had deep conversations yet with the services on the topic of mitigation. I think there's some stuff to be worked out there. The only thing I will say is that land acquisition was in the PFA report identified as one of the options. So I think it needs to be on the table. And I could see some value just from, an ecological perspective of certain properties having high value for the covered species for sure, if they were acquired or a conservation easement. But I think there's a lot to be developed. And so I personally support holding off for a year so we can kind of get our ducks in a row and make sure, we're doing the right thing here. Thank you.
I agree, Jennifer, that the PFA report anticipates land acquisitions along with a lot of things. I think that the question has to be is return on value to the species. And in my view, public ownership, it's very difficult to draw a straight line from public ownership of property to return on value to the species. There are a lot of means where we can talk about specific management regimes that may benefit the species. And I would encourage applicants who want to, pursue benefits to the covered species as mitigation for take of the covered species to describe the value of their project in those terms. For me, there are trade-offs associated with public ownership of lands that are wholly independent of and not directly related to return on benefit to the species. And if public ownership comes at a cost delta relative to other strategies that accomplish the same ends, then I'm going to personally prioritize those other strategies. I think that there's some vision that public ownership will serve to create co-benefits or mutual benefits for other environmental priorities. And personally, I'm skeptical of those and not interested in pursuing them with PFA mitigation dollars.
All right. Did anyone have any other comments? Thank you, everyone, for the discussion. This was a very helpful discussion. I'm going to close out the staff report section unless anyone had any other questions on the 3 topics we talked about.
Well, Andy, did we come to a decision, or do we agree on delaying acquisitions for a year? Do we need to close that loop or just move on and talk about it at the next meeting?
I don't think we need to do any formalized voting or anything. It does sound like we are delaying it. I was just going to put in the grant guidelines that it is not in year 1 as a placeholder, and then maybe at our September we can continue the conversation.
That sounds good. I think it's important to close the loop eventually so that it doesn't just become something we discuss at every meeting until next year.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, thank you everyone for that discussion on those agenda item topics. We do appreciate the insight. So now I was gonna hand it back to you, Chad, for presentations from Kate and Chris. Looks like he's still muted there. Kate, are you? Chris was recommending that maybe you go first. Is that okay with you, Kate?
Let me get off mute. Yeah, that's fine with me.
Great. If you'd like me to share my screen or
However,
yours.
yeah, whatever works for you. We don't have like full functionality of Microsoft Teams at NIMS because it's not an approved platform for us to host on. So it might be better for you to present your screen. We can attend meetings and stuff, but we have a very like bare bones function on our screens that we can manipulate.
Great. Yours is loading right now. Give me just a quick second. I will share my screen. Just let me know when to advance the slides.
Maybe I will just offer up a little framing or context for why we have Kate and Chris presenting today for members of the public. I think we heard from committee members an interest in hearing from the federal agencies as well as the state agencies who are ex officio members on the committee, more about what they view as priorities in the context of eligible projects that could be funded through the Private Forest Accord Mitigation Fund. So this month we have the federal agencies, and then just as a reminder, in September, ODFW will be presenting to you all with their perspective on those priorities. We've got multiple divisions from the agency coming to present to you next month. So I really appreciate Kate and Chris taking the time to do this and just acknowledge that, you know, we're moving the train down, we're laying tracks as we're moving the train. So just acknowledging that, I know that'll be something Kate kind of talks about as well, but it's still, given the fact that we are planning on having a RFP open in October, I think it's a great opportunity for the public and potential applicants to be hearing from the agencies about what some of those conservation priorities are. So thanks to you both for doing this today. We appreciate the time.
Sure, thanks for teeing it up. And I see that the presentation is on the screen, so at least it's appearing for me. So I appreciate that. And I'll just let you know when to advance
Sounds good.
The topics. Let's see. So good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Kate Wells. I am the Willamette Branch Chief for NOAA Fisheries. I'm also currently supervising the Oregon Coast Branch. At the request of this group, I put together a short presentation that provides some information and tools that might be helpful while considering projects to support, while considering projects that would be supported by this mitigation fund. And full disclosure, I'm still learning the HCP process. I've been involved as, you know, the kind of temporary Oregon Coast Branch Chief for a while in the Western Oregon HCP and the Elliott, things like that. But I am by no means an expert on HCPs or HCP implementation. So I did get some help from my colleagues in putting this presentation together. And it's also one of the reasons why this is a very high level presentation. But I'll do what I can to answer any questions you might have at the end. Thanks. So here are the highlights of what I'll be covering today. First, I'll review the list of covered species for which the applicant is requesting an incidental take permit. And then I'll outline some resources that will be useful when reviewing projects being considered for funding. And then I'll go over ESA coverage for the early mitigation projects. And then I'll go through some ITP issuance criteria. And lastly, I'll mention a few things that NIMS is mulling over as we go through this process and as things start to congeal for the mitigation fund. So here you can see the proposed list of covered species for which ODF is applying for HCP coverage from NIMS. As a reminder, ESU stands for Evolutionarily Significant Unit, which is the classification given to unique species of salmon. And DPS stands for Distinct Population Segment, which is the classification given to unique steelhead species. All covered species are treated as if they are federally listed for the purposes of this HCP. And this ensures that the services will provide regulatory assurances for the non-listed covered species consistent with the requirements of the ESA in the event of their future listing. But the majority of these are either threatened or endangered. I just did not have time to go back and assign them each of their categories. It is in the HCP though. I've seen a draft of chapter 1 and they do designate them as which ones are threatened and endangered. So I thought it might be worth running through some basic information as a reminder of how independent populations are the building blocks of ESUs and DPSs and how they contribute to the overall viability of the species. This illustration shows the 3 levels of biological hierarchy. The ESU or DPS is essentially a metapopulation defined by the common characteristics of populations within a geographic range. 2 criteria define a salmon ESU or a steelhead DPS under the ESA. It must be substantially reproductively isolated from other non-specific units. And 2, it must represent an important component of the evolutionary legacy of the species. Then we move down to strata, which are groups of populations that have been isolated from one another or over a longer time scale than the individual populations, but which retain some degree of connectivity. And then there are the independent populations, which is a group of fish of the same species that spawn in a particular lake or stream or portions thereof at a particular season, and do not interbreed with fish from any other group spawning in a different place or in the same place at a different season. So I thought it was important to review this information so everyone is aware of the level to which we analyze effects of proposed actions, which is down to the population level. So in other words, NIMS will examine the effects of the covered activities on independent populations to determine how they impact the viability of the ESU or DPS. This also means we'll look at how proposed conservation strategies are able to offset the impacts of covered activities at the population level. And thus we tend to emphasize the importance of restoration projects that are able to address limiting factors for recovery at the population level. So we can go to the next slide. So now we come to the resources that I'm trying to provide you. Given the large list of species, I thought I kind of threw around the idea of providing websites for each of the recovery plans. But when I saw the list of species and what was included, I quickly nixed that idea and thought I would just give you the general overview of some of the resources that would be most appropriate to use when evaluating or formulating a project to be submitted for grant funding. So the first tool I wanted to make you aware of are the recovery plans, which exist for each species, each listed species. All recovery plans are easily found online. You can simply Google them and they will come right up. So they are very readily available. Each recovery plan discusses threats and limiting factors that are impeding the species recovery. And here I've listed a few examples of those threats or limiting factors, including things like destruction or adverse modification of critical habitat, lack of habitat access or presence of artificial fish passage barriers, and poor water quality. Recovery plans usually make note of specific recovery strategies or actions that would address these limiting factors for recovery at both the ESU and population levels. That information can be used to help inform mitigation project design. And they're often cited in project narratives that are submitted for grant funding. When developing a project narrative, it's generally really helpful to explain how a proposed project would specifically address a limiting factor that's been identified in a recovery plan. And that way the reviewer knows where the biological uplift would be focused. We can go to the next slide. So another great resource are the 5-year status reviews. NIMS is required to conduct 5-year status reviews to ensure that the listing classifications of species are accurate. Now, whether they actually are published on a 5-year rotation, some are lagging further behind than others. But these are also readily Googleable. They're available online, and I provided the website on the webpage on our website that acts as kind of a clearinghouse for all of the status reviews, and that does contain the most up to date. So even if they are older than 5 years, it may still be the most up to date status review. So just keep that in mind. Don't think that there is something necessarily newer out there in terms of a status review if it's not on that webpage, because they do keep it up to date. The 5-year status reviews can contain a wealth of information, including what NIMS priorities are for species recovery. Grant applications that I've seen come in will often include some information on how the proposed project would help support the recommendations for future actions found in those status reviews. So again, making that link between the project and what factors it is supporting to support recovery of the species. Next slide. So mitigation projects that are going to be implemented or funded for implementation prior to the HCP could likely use our slopes programmatic consultation instrument that we have with the Corps in order to get Section 7 coverage. Now, SLOPES is an acronym. It stands for Standard Local Operating Procedures for Endangered Species. And this is a programmatic ESA Section 7 consultation that NIMS has with the Corps of Engineers, Portland District. And SLOPES 5 restoration specifically covers restoration activities. I'm thinking, and others that I've discussed this with in the office, are thinking that most, if not all, mitigation projects would likely need a Corps permit and thus trigger Section 7 consultation with NIMS. And if those projects meet the design criteria in the slopes programmatic, they would be able to use that for Section 7 coverage. And that's a fairly expeditious review process of about 30 days if we get a complete package with all the complete information. Next slide. And here are a few typical examples of restoration or mitigation projects that we often see and review. Process-based restoration, meaning stage 0, stage 8, stage 3 type restoration is very important because these help to build resiliency through climate change and fires. NIMS also has new fish passage criteria, and there are many culverts that need to be replaced in order to meet those standards. So I included that as a good example as well. And that's another thing that's also available online is NIMS updated fish passage guidance. And you can find that. It was just released over 2022, 2023. There's 3 documents, I think, in total that were recently released. to help support improve fish passage. And as I said, when discussing the previous slide, most of these projects fall within the scopes of sloped programmatic coverage. These are very typical things that we see come through our office. Next slide. And then I just wanted to briefly touch on some ITP issuance criteria information. And you can see on this slide, I pulled some up on the screen there. And this is from the ESA regs and the HCP handbook. And note that part of the ITP issuance criteria, as you see here, includes the need to demonstrate that take is being minimized and mitigated to the maximum extent practicable. The HCP handbook goes on to clarify that this ESA regulation means to fully offset any impacts expected to remain after avoidance and minimization measures are implemented. So to NIMS, that means the mitigation projects funded through the mitigation fund will need to be described in terms of what suites of covered activities they are intended to offset the effects of, and what fish populations would benefit. Linking these two is part of what we would need to ensure that the conservation strategy will fully offset the adverse effects of the covered activities. Next slide. So as we go through this process, NIMS, as one of the resource agencies that will eventually be reviewing the ITP application to determine if it meets issuance criteria, we're thinking about how mitigation funded through this program would be tracked. For example, how will covered activity impacts be linked to mitigation projects? How will mitigation projects be linked to fish populations? What type of instruments would be used to track mitigation project implementation? Who will keep a record of the magnitude to which any specific project offsets the adverse effects of covered activities? Where will the information on what species and populations would see uplift be housed? This tracking process is important to NIMS because we require a reasonable amount of certainty that what's ultimately implemented in terms of the conservation strategy will fully offset the adverse effects of the covered activities. And thus, that helps us to determine whether or not the HCP meets the ITP issuance criteria. And I think all of these things are part of what this group is tasked with as part of this exercise and putting this together. So I look forward to seeing how that continues to progress. Last slide. And that's all I have for now. So thanks for having me here today. I'm happy to try to answer any questions. I can do the best that I can. But yeah, that's what I've got for you.
Looks like Heath has a hand up, I believe.
Hey, that was a great presentation. Thank you. And this is a little bit of a pop quiz for you, and you may not know the answer, but one of the advantages of the private forest accord is, in fact, the idea that we are mobilizing $15 million a year toward these mitigation efforts. Are you aware of any other programmatic HCPs that are spending that kind of money on mitigation year over year?
I don't really know how to answer that because I don't know. I mean, the other HCPs have conservation strategies, of course. I don't know what the financials are that go into making those happen.
Well, the conservation measures are one thing. I just mean in terms of cash funded mitigation measures, you know, to cover the remaining impacts of incidental take. That strikes me as a very aggressive investment and one, you know, we can be proud of. And I just wondered if you had any relativity there.
Yeah, I'm not aware, but like I said, my scope of understanding and experience with HCPs is pretty limited. I think Fish and Wildlife Service does a lot more than NIMS does, so maybe Chris might have a better gauge on that. I'm probably just not the best person to answer. Sorry.
No worries, my fault.
I think Mark was next.
Yeah, I guess sort of Heath, thinking about your question, and Kate or Chris, I don't know if you chime in, but I'm thinking about BPA. They have a pretty big funding. I'm not sure if it's tied to an HCP, but clearly, yeah, okay. My question was a little bit different, just, in all the documents we've been reading, we've been talking about 10 covered species. And I think in the beginning, Kate, you showed, quite a few. So I wasn't sure if all the ones that you showed were sort of the target species, if you will, for the private forest accord. Maybe Jennifer can answer that too, along with you.
Yeah, well, it's my understanding. So the list that I saw also had that kind of compressed list of species, but then it said something to the effect of like all native salmonids or something. So the full list is a lot.
Yeah.
And
Salmon and trout.
And that's what appears in HCP chapter 1, the draft. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jennifer can chime in for sure.
I was just gonna say exactly what you just said. What's in the PFA report is the short list, but when you take the all native salmon and trout and expand it out, that list grows a lot. And you only showed the nymphs covered species as well. I'm sure Chris is gonna chime in with those under her jurisdiction. So there's even more.
Yeah, that's right. I would, because I know Chris was presenting today also, I kept it just our list, so just nymphs to stay in our ITP issuance lane for the species that we would cover for our potential permit.
I just had a quick response to Heath's question, and our office is working on a number of HCPs, but I believe we've only got a couple on the ground, one being the Deschutes HCP, and don't quote me on this, but I do know they have a mitigation program under that HCP, but I think it's like $1.5 million annually, something like that.
All right, any other, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to go back to those thoughtful and provocative questions that Kate was posing for us all to be thinking about. Andy, maybe if you wouldn't mind even putting that slide back up, the things to consider. I think this is probably, so she really kind of articulated the biggest question mark that I'm holding at the moment, which is what are the expectations coming out of the HCP for tracking or ledgering, if you will, mitigation actions, and who does that? Is that this grant program, or is that ODF as part of their being the holder of the HCP? And so I don't know that any of us have the answers to that quite yet. I know that we will be meeting with ODF very soon. We're also, Andy and I are going to start listening into the HCP steering committee meetings. And so while I feel like these are questions that we need to grapple with, I think these are also questions that the HCP steering committee and others need to grapple with as well. So I guess we'll just hold that, just ask you all to hold that question mark with me.
Yeah.
I just have a clarifying question for Kate on this slide right here. Bullet point 1, the affected fish populations. Can you describe what affected fish populations mean And specifically, does that mean fish populations affected by the covered activities? And does that
Yeah.
mean then that we
Yes.
need to make sure that the mitigation is occurring in watersheds that have a nexus with private
Mhm.
forests that have those covered activities happening?
Yeah, exactly what you said. That is my understanding of how it should work. So
Right.
I think clearly being able to document what mitigation projects are intended to offset the effects of what covered activities at what scale on the ground is necessary for those tracking purposes, for the services to have enough certainty that overall the effects would be fully offset with this being part of the conservation strategy package.
Thanks for that, Kate. I think that that's helpful for this committee as we're looking at
Mhm.
grant proposals to ensure
Yeah.
that there is that nexus with the private forest lands and that we're not
Mhm.
just funding activities to cover the species wherever they may be present.
Yeah, and that was yeah, that was a concern that I kind of had because I wasn't hearing discussion to that specific effect. So that's why I wanted to bring it up here. And yeah, these are all things that NIMS is mulling over. And we know that there are not answers to all of these right now, but these are things that as we draft our BIOP and we look at the section 10 findings where we have to document specifically how the HCP will comply with each of the ITP issuance criteria. It's pretty specific. And so thinking ahead to the information that we're going to need to inform those processes is part of our train of thought here.
Thank you, Kate. That's very helpful.
And Kate and maybe Chris, maybe I should just go learn some more about other approved HCPs. This conversation is teeing up like you're going to model or divine the number of individuals that may be taken, and then model or divine the number of individuals that may be propagated or, encouraged through mitigation. And I've never seen that kind of analysis supporting an HCP. I've been involved in a couple of them on the private side, and it's always been much more, let's say, big picture than that. Is that what you anticipate here?
Well, from my limited experience, I've seen HCPs be rather generic, but when we do our Section 7 BIOP, we need to drill down into the population level, not necessarily individuals that are specifically impacted by a specific activity, but we often use surrogates for take. Miles of road constructed within a certain distance of streams, percent or amounts of harvest, acreage harvested, things like that. Those are surrogates for take that we look at. So it's not like 5 fish will be impacted by this. It doesn't get to that level because we can't do that most times. We use the habitat effects as the surrogate for take.
Agreed.
But we do need to look at the population scale to see what activities are impacting which populations and roll it up to see how those impacts influence the viability of the species.
I agree with all of
And
that.
yeah.
And it's easier on the surrogates for take side of it than the how many salmon am I going to generate by moving this road, right? That is to say, that math is not a 1-to-1 formula. I've never seen it done in that way.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to, that's one of the things that we have to look at there, what would be appropriate to offset what effect and at what scale. Those are all questions that we look at.
Chad?
Yeah, Kate, would it be reasonable to consider a surrogate that Heath is talking about as like miles of stream opened or habitat opened due to removal of fish passage barriers. Is that
It
something
could
that
be.
would be considered?
It could be. Mhm.
Okay,
But
thank
it
you.
depends on the scenario and
Right.
yeah. Mhm.
But if you
The-
start like, if
mhm.
you start saying that's going to produce so many fish, that science starts getting pretty weak.
Shaky,
You know,
right.
that's pretty shaky.
Yeah. Mhm.
Understood. Thank you.
All right, guys, I think we're wrapping up on the time here, a little bit over. Thanks, Kate, for that presentation. That was very helpful and very
Sure.
informative. Thank you so
No
much.
problem.
And for everyone on the call, just like every other meeting, we'll be uploading these presentations afterwards and whatnot. All right, Chris, I believe you're up next. Did you want me to share your screen, my screen, or did you want to?
Let me give it a shot first, Andy, and if I have any trouble,
Please.
we'll fall back to that.
Yep. Ready when you are. All right, we got it. You're good to go.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. For those that don't know me, my name's Chris Allen. I work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of our Oregon Fish and Wildlife office, and I'm the Aquatic Resources Division Manager there. For my presentation today, I think I'd like to say up front, it'll look fairly similar to Kate's, and that's because I utilized her outline for mine as well, but then also. Andy queued up Kate and I with a series of questions, and hopefully you'd be hearing consistent, similar responses as one federal family, right, Kate? But there is, I think, a difference here in our presentations that'll be obvious, and that is that the majority of covered species that would fall under the service are not listed, federally listed, as compared to the number of salmon and steelhead DPSs and ESUs that you saw in Kate's presentation. So I'll focus a little more on that in a few minutes. Similar to Kate's presentation, I want to walk through the list of covered species under our jurisdiction, the Fish and Wildlife Services, and I say that loosely. By that, I just mean if they were all listed, they would fall under our agency rather than NOAA. I will touch on some resources for mitigation fund applicants and reviewers to determine the appropriateness of those projects submitted for funding. I highlighted the next two bullets because consistent with what Kate shared and also Jennifer a little bit ago, these are challenging questions to answer at this point in the process. And I think it'll take us getting further down the HCP path before we have a better idea of how to provide guidance on this. For one, the Fish and Wildlife Service needs to have much more internal conversations, especially with our sister agency NOAA, and then also with the HCP steering committee before we have many details here. So my touch in on those pieces in this presentation are really at the 30,000 foot level. And then similar to Kate, I'll queue up a few of the things that we're discussing internally or need to have additional external conversations about. So here's the list of covered species that Kate didn't cover. And this accommodates the statement, all native salmon and trout species in Oregon. So we've got bull trout, Lahontan cutthroat trout, coastal cutthroat, rainbow, what I call rainbow / red band, and then Great Basin red band trout in the very extreme southeast part of our state, and then West Slope cutthroat. So those are the trout. Let me circle back up at the top and give a little more info. I highlighted bull trout and Lahontan, just as those are the only two species that are federally listed. Of those species covered by the Fish and Wildlife Service, bull trout are listed threatened range-wide, so across all of Oregon, including some other western states. Lahontan cutthroat trout are also listed threatened. Their range is primarily in California and Nevada. There's a very small sliver of Southeast Oregon that has very little private forest activity on. So really, I think Lahontan cutthroat trout, even though it's listed here, I really don't envision it as being a species that will play much of a role in the HCP, but bull trout definitely would. And then moving down the rest of the list, coastal cutthroat, no federal status. They are considered an ODFW strategy species, and I'll define that right now. It is at the bottom of this slide. A strategy species is essentially a species that ODFW has highlighted as having a small or declining population or otherwise at risk. If you look at the Oregon Conservation Strategy, these species are also referred to as Oregon species of greatest conservation need. So coastal cutthroat trout are included on that list for ODFW. So are rainbow trout statewide. And for those that don't track a lot of fish details, rainbow are west of the Cascade Crest. Red band trout, even though it's same species, is east of the Cascade Crest. We refer to those as red band or interior red band trout. No federal status there, but again, they are also part of ODFW strategy species. Great Basin red band trout, no federal status, ODFW strategy species. And then West Slope cutthroat trout, primarily found in Idaho and Montana, but we have a small disjunct population in the John Day Basin, again, covered as a ODFW strategy species. Mountain whitefish, pretty ubiquitous within the Columbia Basin in Western Oregon. They have no federal status, no ODFW status either. Now switching over to 5 amphibians that were included as covered species in the private forest accords. Columbia torrent salamander, petition for listing. Our agency will be making a 12-month finding next fiscal year. This species is also included on ODFW strategy species list. Southern torrent salamander, it was petitioned and not warranted finding back in 2000. It has no federal status. ODFW strategy species. Moving on, coastal giant salamander, no federal status, not included as an ODFW strategy species. So on and so forth. For copes, giant salamander, and tailed frog, again, no federal status for those species, but they are covered under ODFW strategy species list. A little more about the Oregon Conservation Strategy, just because, again, highlighting my message on those previous slides, the vast majority of the covered species here are not under the Fish and Wildlife Service's jurisdiction. They're really solely under ODFW's management. I guess it'd be fair to say also, in some cases, tribal co-management. But this conservation strategy that was last updated in 2016 did involve the Fish and Wildlife Service. We reviewed and approved that plan in 2016. It's an overarching plan to conserve our state's fish and wildlife and their habitat. Combines best available science, conservation priorities with recommended actions and tools. There's 60 fish included under the conservation strategy, including 17 amphibians. Specific habitats, conservation opportunities were identified, as well as key conservation issues. So I guess my point with presenting a little bit of this is that unlike all the species that Kate covered, or many of them that have federal recovery plans with very detailed analyses of threats and recovery actions identified, we don't have that on the Fish and Wildlife Service side for the vast majority of our species that are covered here. Really, the primary source of any sort of assessment and strategy lies underneath the state's conservation strategy. I will talk for just a couple of minutes about bull trout, since that really is our primary listed species that falls under the Fish and Wildlife Service that will come into play in the HCP. We finalized a recovery plan for that species in 2015. The full range is shown in this illustration here. The species is broken out into a number of recovery units, of which Oregon has 4. We call those recovery unit implementation plans, and they are under the umbrella 2015 recovery plan. In Oregon, we've also developed a step-down approach to help implement the recovery plan. We call that the Oregon Bull Trout Strategy. And then also for bull trout, right now we're conducting a species status assessment as well as a 5-year review. And Kate talked a little bit about 5-year reviews. Both of those are due at the end of this calendar year, with the 5-year review essentially serving to assess whether the current classification as threatened across the range is still appropriate and any sort of recommendations for any changes needed. Talking about conservation planning for those remaining covered fish that I listed at the front end of my presentation. Again, these fall under really the state's jurisdiction in any sort of conservation planning that the state has. And there is some material for mitigation fund applicants to work from. There are species management unit state assessment plans and conservation recovery plans for some of these species, including coastal cutthroat trout. Again, for rainbow and red band, both west side and east side, we're talking about the same species as a steelhead. So essentially those recovery plans for steelhead would serve for conservation activities for rainbow and red band as well. I'm not going to go through the rest of this. It was really just my effort to show that in the absence of a federal recovery plan, there is conservation happening and some resources to turn to develop mitigation proposals for these species. For the amphibians, that's a little harder for me to summarize here in terms of any sort of conservation planning documents. For the most part, all 5 of these species are in the western part of the state. A lot of them are on Forest Service and BLM lands. None of them are federally listed, as I mentioned. There is some conservation occurring on those public lands by the BLM and the Forest Service. Not so easy for me to quickly summarize at this point, so we'll have to maybe come back to that if folks are looking for more information. I did include just a little bit of distribution information here, just so folks have that broader context of where these species exist in the state. I guess final note, with the exception of the coastal giant salamander, the other 4 amphibians here are covered under the Oregon Conservation Strategy. This is a slide that looks a little similar to what you saw from Kate, titled a little differently, but just mechanisms for ESA Section 7 coverage for any mitigation fund actions that would occur prior to finalization of the HCP. Many of those, especially in-water work, would require a core permit, which would trigger consultation with our agency on the issuance of that permit, and thereby providing a means for us to provide any sort of ESA coverage needed for effects to either listed species covered under the accords or any other species that may be affected, listed species, by mitigation funded actions. Also, similar to what Kate mentioned, we also have a slopes programmatic consultation in place with the Corps that would include a lot of actions that could potentially affect bull trout in the state of Oregon. And then lastly, any mitigation funded actions that would occur on Forest Service or BLM managed lands may qualify for a restoration programmatic that we have with those 2 agencies as well. NIMS has that programmatic in place as well. So I think that may cover some of the actions that we come across here prior to the HCP being completed. This was just my boiled down statement regarding issuance criteria for the incidental take permit under mitigation, worded maybe a little differently, but still kind of rooted in the HCP handbook. But we're looking at mitigation as essentially being actions that offset impacts to covered species and their habitats that are expected to remain after avoidance and minimization measures that are outlined in the HCP once completed and implemented. I didn't want to completely rehash some of the topics that Kate listed here, so this isn't fully comprehensive, but it's maybe some additional topics that we're discussing internally here within the Fish and Wildlife Service that we also need to queue up with NIMS, and then back out to the HCP authors. But the first is, will the HCP provide ESA take coverage for the mitigation fund program? I don't feel like we've really answered that yet. And I'm really curious to see where we go with that question. Related to that, how do other watershed grant programs like OWEBs function regarding ESA permitting? In my conversations with Mark and others at OWEB, applicants are primarily responsible for obtaining their own ESA permitting. OWEB doesn't have any sort of programmatic consultation in place with the services. The third bullet, during HCP development, should we have an advanced mitigation plan be developed and memorialized in a formal agreement with the services? I know that's something that we've just started discussing. That's being pulled from section 357 of the HCP handbook. And then moving on, what instrument will be used to track advanced mitigation? Who will manage it? I think Kate had that same question. Similar to the next bullet, how will the services have enough certainty that mitigation will fully offset the adverse effects of the covered activities in order for us to be able to issue an incidental take permit? And then lastly, and I know there is some guidance in the HCP handbook on this, but I think it's a conversation we need to be having, particularly with the few species that have been petitioned that the Fish and Wildlife Service is reviewing right now for potential listing in the state. Western ridge mussel comes to mind, as does western pond turtle. Anyway, how would newly listed species be accommodated within an existing finalized HCP? So that's a snapshot of the topics under consideration here internally. And then I'll close with just a picture of a beaver. I was happy to see Kate mention beaver in one of her slides. And even though beaver is not a covered species under the Accords, it's definitely I don't know what we call it, but definitely a highlighted focal species that provides ecosystem benefits to all the aquatic species that Kate and I have discussed today. And I didn't want that to be overshadowed by all those other aquatic species today. I wanted to highlight beaver again as a key part of the Accords. And with that, Andy, I think I'll call it good.
All right, thanks, Chris. If you wanted to go back to your other slide with the questions, just to facilitate any discussion. Yeah, I guess at this point, if you have any questions, we still have time right now. We have a few minutes left in this agenda item. Really great presentation. Thank you, Chris and Kate. Mark, go ahead. Oh, you're muted, Mark.
From both Chris and Kate, I'm kind of digesting just from a consultation section 7 perspective, the complexities of all of these. And I guess I'm wondering, does that mean most project applicants would need to have gone through some sort of consultation before they submit their proposal? And since the HCP obviously isn't near final yet, is there any sort of blanket process, or blanket's maybe the wrong word, programmatic process for people participating in this program to work through their consultation issues?
Yeah. I don't know if there is an obvious mechanism, Mark, to do that. ahead of the HCP being finalized. I guess I would again fall back to the fact that a lot of these stream restoration type actions would require a Corps permit, some of which would fall under existing programmatics that we have with the Corps, and others that would have to occur individually. And a lot of those are actions that, not to get too into the weeds, but may not have adverse effects at all, but require some sort of review by the service. Under Section 7, we just do a quick, what we call a concurrence letter with the Corps on issuance of their permit. So I guess maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I'm hoping either existing programmatics or these individuals with the Corps would provide applicants with any sort of ESA permitting required. I don't think that will fit every action that comes in, but I'm hoping it would fit the majority. I guess I'd also queue up Mark Grembermer from OWEB as well, if he has any feedback to your question, just given that OWEB doesn't have any sort of programmatic consultation in place with the services, and all their applicants obtain their own ESA permitting. So maybe Kate or Mark, maybe you have some additional info to add.
No, I think you covered it. I think you're spot on. We're thinking that the majority of this stuff would be covered under existing programmatics, and you know, those that don't, that have a federal nexus would trigger an individual consultation as the other route. So I think the majority of them would fall under the existing programmatics, though.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the overview of how OWEB engages with applicants permitting is accurate. We do provide funding primarily through technical assistance grants that applicants can use to help navigating the permitting system, but we don't directly engage.
So 2 comments. One, again, great presentation. Chris, and I heard, you know, there's the degree of specificity with respect to offsetting the impacts of incidental take. It seems to me would be appropriately calibrated to what you think might be the amount of incidental take that occurs. That is to say, in circumstances where, due to the conservation measures implemented, there is no or virtually no incidental take, then I don't know that the math has to be too pointy-headed. That is to say, for many of us on the industry side, we thought that this level of investment in mitigation would radically outweigh any remaining incidental take. We thought that the conservation measures we were implementing were doing a very good job of avoiding incidental take in the first instance. And I appreciate that the Section 7 consultation is still to come on that, but my hope is that's the case and that we don't have to wring our hands a great deal about the precision and whether or not this amount of money is, and the measures we intend to take are sufficient. So that was kind of one comment. It would be unfortunate if we approached this RAND compromise from the perspective of, well, we'll see if it's good enough. So that was one comment, and I'm not claiming you guys, either of you, took that position. So that was one. The second one is, in the context of mitigation, and I actually haven't been involved in any of this, I suppose I would be surprised if the ESA gives you a lot of trouble. That is to say, we're talking about ESA coverage for doing things that are decidedly good for the species, right? And the idea that the services would show up and say, oh, hey, hold on a minute here. In the process of helping 1,000 trout, you may kill a trout. I appreciate that may require ESA coverage, but my hope is that the services would have some mechanism or sufficient foresight to accommodate those outcomes relatively expeditiously. I would hate for red tape to get in the way of doing good things for the species.
Yeah, Heath, I guess to both of your questions, I don't disagree at all. HCPs in general, but especially mitigation, large mitigation program like this, we don't have a lot of experience with that in our office. We've got 2 people with HCP experience, but even on the mitigation fund, both of them have acknowledged like we really need to be chatting with some of our folks nationally to better understand how to approach some of these questions. But in general, a response to your second statement is I agree, and we do a lot of that in the service, acknowledging that conservation actions need ESA coverage, but generally, we're covering short-term adverse effects for long-term gain, and we give the benefit of the doubt in many cases because of that. So I don't disagree with anything you said. I do think we've got a lot of discussions that need to occur, between now and finalization of the HCP on that topic. But I appreciate you highlighting that.
Chad up next.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Chris, for the presentation. It was a great presentation. One thing that Kate provided was project examples that were considered to qualify as mitigation. And I'm just wondering if you have something similar that you could provide. And then Andy, I'd like to ask if we can get those posted to the new website that's under development, just to help applicants understand, what clearly do qualify as mitigation. Some of those pre-existing projects that have already been determined as mitigation, I saw like culvert replacement and things like that. It'd be nice to just put that list up there.
Yeah, Chad, I'd be happy to do that. Easy enough for me to do with the trout piece. A little more challenging with the amphibians, just because that's not my wheelhouse. But I can definitely work with some of our folks on staff to come up with some examples, just to give applicants an idea of what mitigation actions may offset impacts to amphibians. So I can pull that together.
That'd be great, Chris, and much appreciated. And that just helps us know that the money we're putting out the door is going to qualify as mitigation, and it helps our applicants know where they should be focusing their efforts in their grant proposals.
And we can
Yep,
also,
makes sense.
Sorry, we can also address some of that in September when ODFW presents as well. We can, sort of drawing from our Oregon conservation strategy, maybe help populate that list with Chris.
Excellent, thank you.
I guess just wrapping up some notes here. Any other questions while we're still on this agenda item? I don't see any additional hands. All right, I think
That's it.
Hand it back to you, Chad, for the closure.
Great. So I'll just kind of review our agenda and what we discussed. We approved the minutes. There was no public comment today. Andy provided an update to the grant review process, the working group, the timelines. We're looking at an 8-week grant request. Update on the land acquisition program. We decided we're going to defer that for at least the first year. And then we've updated the in-person MAC meeting to sometime in mid-February with the hope and the goal to make sure that that's completed in time for going in front of the commission in March, their meeting. We had great presentations by both Kate Wells and Chris Allen. And that's the meeting summary. Any remarks from the rest of the committee? Any topics we'd like to include in future meetings that haven't already been identified?
I would just say thanks to Kate and Chris for their presentations. They're really helpful. And at some point, I think I saw in your notes, Andy, we want to talk about grant size, if there's a minimum or a maximum, or how we're going to approach that. Not to be decided today, but it seemed like something you had in those documents is for us to circle back to.
Correct.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. Okay, any other comments before we close? All right, well, hearing none, we will adjourn the meeting.
Thanks for the extra time.
Yeah, Thanks, Chad.
everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Bye, everybody.
See you.